What's been done, Fabian?
Yeah, so this is more of an FYI. I shared sort of general information about this working group in the product meeting yesterday to make the product organization aware that this is an ongoing effort. And I also tried to highlight that it is very likely that some of the things that this working group is going to do will raise product questions, and that those product questions will need to be discussed in a dialogue with engineering. And there was already some good discussion in the call overall. Jerry provided some context, but my goal here was to sort of raise the visibility in product as well, and sort of start preparing for potential impact in a couple of months when we are actually iterating towards solutions.
Yeah, thanks for pointing us out to that item in the product agenda. I did add some feedback, and this is actually all starting to tie together in some ways, because there are separate conversations about. There's an item that Christopher added below that also ties into this. So I think the most important thing is that CAP is going to start driving some of our decisions, and we can't have all three things in the CAP theorem be true anymore, and that's going to have to essentially it's going to affect the product in some ways. So
yes, and we can maybe discuss a little bit down in the agenda, because I have some thoughts.
Yeah, the one thing we want to be careful here, Fabian, is just that we don't confuse policy and implementation and make them magically come together, because I have a feeling that our policy is going to change 3 times in the next 5 years. That's just what my gut says, depending on different scenarios and different situations. So, it might be good to kick off those policy discussions. Just let's make sure we don't conflate that with like basic mechanisms we need to get in place and like things we need to do just to make the system scale from that perspective.
No, I think actually my intent is to specifically point out that those are different things that need to be driven at different levels. Right? It's like, I think as a product organization, we actually, I'm still reading, right? I'm not really sure we exactly know where we want to go, right? With like tenancy and all of those things, and they may change, right? And whatnot. Yeah. And
agree completely. That's why I'm saying deep thought can be invested in the where do we want to go. Let's just make sure that we're still working on the engineering side. Like, let's not like, oh, okay, well, we got to stop everybody to talk about where we want to go. Let's do those in parallel, because I think there's so much complexity of this problem that there's like a lot of changes that we need to do as independent of that. But yeah, I agree with that.
All right. So next item is please read Andreas MR on read mostly and provide feedback. I already added some comments there, and it turns out I had not read the entire thing, I guess, but yes, please provide feedback there. Records.
Yeah, thanks. So we had a call with Camille and decided to take a little different strategy regarding improvements to the CI builds data model. We want to create a new table that is going to accelerate builds queuing, and this is a prerequisite for like sharding, perhaps moving forward with the primary key migrations, or at least making it easier. Then we are thinking about introducing a separate table and supporting both tables at the same time. Of course, this strategy is still work in progress. It might change depending on what we learn as we move forward, but that's the current plan.
I wanted to add emphasis on that coming from today's incident. So we had a database incident today that we just read up, and the problem that you described with CI builds is very much at the core of that incident. And yeah, just wanted to answer.
I'm having a hard time hearing you, Andreas. I don't know if anybody else is.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Then just skip over that.
Camille.
Yeah, so we also had a call like on Friday with Grzegorz and Fabian about composable blueprint, code-based blueprint. It doesn't directly like answer that access layer concern, but this is one of the approaches to make our performance of the application better over time. So I hope that we are pretty close on kind of getting this into final shape. And I think, Gary, it will probably be on your agenda either Friday or Monday
Okay.
to put some additional tweaks to it. I also discussed with Craig about the data access layer extensively, and we may kind of consider maybe opening an additional blueprint or something that would discuss that in a more detail from the application level approach, because I think there are a few aspects that are not covered in the composable code base that would be maybe important to consider. But about that later. Gary, your item.
Yeah, I just made a few updates to the sharding blueprint for things that either have come up in discussions, like the shard sizing is something Camille mentioned. And then based on conversations that I've had over the last few hours, you know, the grouping versus sharding is not the same thing, which I think is essentially what Christopher is saying with, you know, policy and implementation are different things. And also highlighting infrastructure concerns, because today we treat the database as a snowflake of sorts. Yes, we've built a lot of automation around it, and in self-managed, everything is automated. But certainly on GitLab.com, which is where we're, you know, where this really comes into play, we don't have the capabilities to run multiple clusters today, and we need to develop those. So just trying to scope the problem better. Fabian.
Yeah, I've done a bit of reading, and I'm aggregating all links and references to handbook pages, epics, merge requests, Google Docs in this issue that have to do with prior work done on database scalability and sharding. This is mainly for my own benefit, because I'd like to understand what other folks have done before us, sometimes the same people. But it may, if you know of anything that's relevant, feel free to contribute to that issue. I'll probably raise an MR to the working group page to aggregate that information, because I think it's important that it is more discoverable.
Okay. I am not aware of any blockers at this time. So let's go on to the discussion. And Fabian, you've got the first point.
Yeah, I think this is quick. We covered this maybe a little bit already. So I think I'm hopeful that we will be able to engage sort of product management and drive some necessary change as well, if needed, to allow us to scale, for example, via sharding. I do believe that there's also an opportunity to, if something is really hard to solve right now, to emphasize that to product management as well. So like, hey, these are some of the things that we may need to address in the future to make it easier. So I think that's it's a good opportunity, but I think we need to be also aware that it's a very big topic, right? And I'm not really clear at this moment what our sort of policy at the moment actually is, or if we have one, or where we will go. But if you have any sort of product concerns, please voice them, and I'll make sure to connect with the right people so that we can have a dialogue, and that's it.
All right. Yeah, I just started there. So I have a coffee chat with a product manager, and we talked about this topic and CAP and all that, and I explained how CAP affects the things that we can do and cannot do, and how today is kind of negligible. And she's like, I didn't know about this, so maybe you should come and talk to product managers about this, because it is like there is some level of awareness that as we scale and do things cannot be the same. But deciding how those things are going to be affected is not something they're aware of. I mean, CUP is a computer science thing, so I don't expect product managers to know about it. But she suggested that I do a video on this because we were actually, in order to explain it to her, I was using GitLab as an example. And that made a lot of sense to her. So I'll work with you, Fabian, to maybe do a short video on it, and so we can populate it through or spread it through product.
Sounds great. I'd love to do that.
All right. Then the next point is mine, which is, you know, we already have some patterns. As it turns out, with Mostly, we already implemented something in December. And so the question, this is more organizational, of okay, we started developing these patterns, we solved some immediate problems, which is sort of the exit criteria for the working group, but then how do we make sure that developers at large are embracing these patterns and using them? And so I looked at the single database write-up, and that obviously, or single data store, and that makes it very clear, you know, you can't just go off and create separate databases. So how do we make sure that these patterns are known to developers, that they're being sort of checked or used, or so that's where my question was. And Camila and Andreas have points on that. I don't know if you want to verbalize them or we just read.
I'm kind of like thinking, because like we can have like very good idea what this pattern do, but actually like enforcing something that we don't know how it's gonna be implemented can be pretty challenging, because like there is like different ways how they could be actually be done. So I'm more like the person of like trying to work by example. If we have a pattern that we want to use, we should provide a exemplary usage of that pattern in a state that everyone can pick an MR, copy it over, and start using that. I'm not really like a big fan of enforcing something that we didn't actually like validated ourselves, and we didn't kind of provide a strong implementation guidance, because I'm then kind of assuming that unless we kind of work with these people closely initially, it will kind of very likely go in completely opposite direction that they intended, and it may not solve the goal that we wanted to achieve. So I'm more like the person of like doing and promoting rather than, I mean, documenting is still valid at any point. Like having a good idea what you want to do is very valid, but I'm not really like a big fan of promoting something that we didn't validate it and provided like exemplary usage of that.
Yeah, actually, that condition is part of the working group exit criteria. So we proposed some patterns, and then we said we will have at least one use case that we've solved using this pattern. If we don't have any, then we discard the pattern. So yes, that's taken into account. And like so in the case of, go ahead, Chin.
Yeah, so we make the blueprint, identify the cases, then pass the case to the relative teams to work on that. Is that the work process? I think this is the way we enforce the working model, right? This working group print out the blueprints, identify the cases that fit into this blueprint, then pass the work to the stage group to work on that.
No, I think we implement the solution, right? And then that's a model that any stage group can use to say, oh, I've got this data pattern and I want to go solve it. And as Camille pointed out, they can look at an MR that actually shows them a working example of how someone did that before. That's why we always said, you know, here's a list of patterns that we think apply to us. Let's solve at least one use case with that, so that we have the pattern and an actual solution of using that. So
cool. We established the first example to show people how to do that.
Right.
Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Just one thing to note that once we have that documented path, we've had really good success in the past with getting every engineer to go through those kinds of things through training format. Really, it's just create an issue and then they follow that issue to basically go through either things to read or go implement some kind of test scenario that we feel like would be valuable to them. So, and I'm happy to support that on this initiative. We're doing this based on retro information around upgrades. I view this kind of in that same category. But to Camille's point, we have to have that working implementation before we want to basically push that broad brush wide distribution.
And I'll jump back to Andreas's point that sharding is not the only thing we're solving here, which goes to nomenclature. So
yeah, and if it turns into like this is not the only thing we should be talking about with every engineer, like I'm willing to review that and basically add whatever else we need to as well.
Right.
For the blueprint that I was working on with read mostly data, it felt a bit like a textbook exercise at the beginning. Like, this is how do you deal with read mostly data? You do caching. What I found hard is to push it in a state where we basically suggest how to, or document how to find read mostly data. Like when you look at the database today, at the application today, how do you even recognize that certain areas might benefit from that? But I think the blueprints, they are really useful if we make them specific enough, like Kamil suggested with examples, and also give guidelines on how to recognize those situations, either by looking at metrics or just knowing the feature. But that would be great if we had this documented in the blueprints.
yeah, and I just added a comment that a lot of that has to do with taxonomy, right? And so, when I wrote the original thing, I just went to the 4 or 5 things that I'd seen on recent database reports and just used those. Okay, this looks like time decay. This looks like read mostly. And that's why I always said, I put these 4 in there. I'm sure there are more. So if there are more, we should add them. And if any of these make no sense, then we should get rid of them. So I think for the working group, this is, the patterns that we agreed are sort of the initial batch, but we should definitely, this dovetails into this whole idea of data management discipline of we need to stop looking at the database as, this table or that thing or that schema and look at the overall picture of, is there a way, the thing that I'm trying to do, is there a way that already solves this without me reinventing the wheel and having 2 stage groups building essentially the same thing? Because we're approaching a scale where this is going to become more, I think, a more significant thing. So, agreed.
And in terms of fanning out the information, I think we can also always start with maintainers, backend maintainers or database maintainers, because they're ultimately the ones that are looking at code and may be able to suggest and recognize those patterns.
The next point is this whole sharding versus tenancy or policy versus implementation, and it's something that is popping up in different contexts. There was an old, when we talked about sharding the last time, there was also a tenant-based proposal, but to me, tenancy is a very different thing from sharding. Sharding is where I'm trying to scale the backend without really thinking about what's going on at the front. And so tenancy to me is something that it's implemented at the top of the stack, where sharding happens at the bottom of the stack. And these 2 things don't really know about each other. There is a routing layer in the middle. So to me, sharding is something that it's very much a technical solution for scalability, which sometimes helps you do tenancy and on the back end. So this is why I'm saying that tenancy and sharding are not the same thing. And one of them is actually, sharding gives you the flexibility to implement tenancy. Tenancy puts a straitjacket on you, and it's a forcing function to shard, but it's not going to shard on a scalability basis. It's going to shard on some policy basis, which we want to avoid getting into that conundrum. So I can definitely put an MR either on the working group page or somewhere else, expanding on this topic. And then Fabian, looks like you found some prior.
I think Christopher has some comments first.
I think we kind of covered this, but basically, I just don't want to stop the momentum of the group. So like that's the key aspect. I want to make sure we keep front and center. So like if we start seeing these issues get conflated, everybody remind themselves, hey, like we need to just implement some basic mechanisms, and then if it turns out that we have to do migrations or other things associated with that, I think that's a trade-off that we're willing to make right now on the guidance of, you know, policy can potentially come later, and we don't want necessarily the implementation just to be for a single policy, because I would expect our policies to change over time.
And so I've done just a little bit of search, and I think actually the call out of, I would be very explicit with what you just said, Jerry, as well. So like, this is what we're trying to accomplish here, because just by reading through all of these connected things, tenancy definitely comes up, right? And it comes sort of up as a thing that we may want to do. And I've done a little bit of search on like what we actually may want to do as a policy. I'm new to this term, by the way. I enjoy it. And I think right now, at least to me, the policy is unclear, right? It may change. So I think it's probably wise to leave it, right? And maybe just be clear that we are not doing this.
Yeah, agreed. All right, Camille.
So I'm kind of like also being part of the GitLab private, but at least from what I understand, it doesn't really affect what we are discussing here. We are more thinking about more like a complete separate way of deploying GitLab somewhere else with a complete separate data stores. But like coming into this meeting, like my whole perception why we are doing that was like to provide a headroom and provide resiliency. There are probably like two key aspects. Sharding alone, I think, will provide a headroom, but will not provide that much of the resiliency. So I think, like, at least from my perspective, is like we need to shard data. Basically, we need to do it. But really, like the second aspect that I had on my mind as part of the composable code base is like better define the boundaries of the application. And now, like when we discuss about the data access layer and all of that stuff, it makes me think that if we have like this common data source, maybe we are at the point where we define a different resiliency guarantees for the different data patterns that we want to use. We know that some aspects of the application are more important because they have really like a very wide effect on the system. And one of my perception about what I want to achieve with this working group is like not shard data, but actually shard data in a way that we can say that we actually increase the resiliency of the GitLab. So we don't have a single feature making GitLab.com down and affecting everyone. And like I'm kind of thinking about this prime example that like user authentication and personal access token is something that everyone uses. And like we use that so extensively for many different functions. But we, for example, have projects, and maybe some of these projects are very noisy, but it should never affect like the user authentication and other projects. So I'm kind of, my perception is like the sharding alone will not solve that hurdle. It will help, but I think like my desired outcome is like we do shard data, but we also have a way to say that GitLab, if we perform this operation, is kind of significantly more bulletproof, and some noisy projects do not affect the rest of the GitLab, and it can still function. And it kind of falls into probably the tenancy, but tenancy thought about like key customers using GitLab.com, but having some kind of dedicated set of the resources that we can use the current architecture. And if we would consider the concept of like, we have the authentication using composable code base running as something completely separate, maybe it's still sharing a majority of the code base, but having much more resilient data store. And we have these customer projects running on some shard. It could be just general database sharding. this could maybe ensure that we can provide kind of like shared tenancy approach without doing like this kind of what we are discussing in the GitLab private. I think that this is my perception, what I would like to achieve in the long term with this scalability group, which is like reduce the data store first, but the second, like define a key components from which the GitLab cannot function, but on the other hand, be prepared to gracefully degrade the functionality of other components to ensure that we still continue operating. That's my way of thinking about what we are doing.
I agree. All right, I think we've talked about tenancy and all this, and we're almost at time. Andreas, some database scalability patterns.
Yeah, I was basically wondering, like the patterns that we are discussing. I think there is, in terms of database scalability, there is more patterns than split patterns. And in fact, we already run into problems with some of them, or we were not. We would benefit from recognizing those as patterns as well. And I was wondering if we should bring those up here, if that is right context for it. And Jerry, you sound like yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I put those 4 early on just to seed the working group, but anything that allows us to scale a database, we should use. Which is why I always said these are just examples. We can choose to throw away, replace, add another. I would say that we should add them now that we, like, if we just thought of something, put an MR together and submit it to the working group page. And then we can decide, you know what, it makes sense to solve this one as part of the exit criteria than this other one, or because at least they're recorded somewhere, right? And then once we either extend the working group or, I mean, we can decide on a specific. So yes, I would vote that we add them now and then make decisions about them versus remembering later, oh, there are other things we could do.
Yeah, sounds good. And I think for many of those, we suffer from those now, and we probably also going to continue having problems with that, even if we do sharding later. For example, right. Long transactions is always going to be a problem in this kind of application.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fabian.
Okay, my next point, I'll be quick, is I found out today by talking to John that Global Search already shards Elasticsearch by project. And so potentially this is, you know, something where we can utilize or reutilize some knowledge that people already gathered, you know, in like limitations or issues. I'm not quite sure how transferable it is, but I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, so that's good. So the stars are aligning.
Yeah. So I want to add. I think it depends on the use case and usage pattern. So it works well for us to distribute the data to different shards, so that there's no single Elasticsearch shard would be too big. It works well for project level search, but it sometimes introduces problem on group level search. Because when you do the group level search, the data may come from different shards that take some time.
Right. And then I will, it's almost time, so I will add Adam's point to next Monday's meeting agenda. So thank you, everyone.